So welcome everyone. This is 11.1 on solving quadratic equations by taking the square root. And notice that this lesson has the same title as 9.1. So we're essentially doing the same thing, right? But with that little twist. Okay. So just to review on what 9.1 was, we're gonna solve these two equations. Solve quadratic equations by taking the square root. So remember, the first thing we do is try and solve for x squared first. Okay, isolate x squared. Here, we are going to isolate x squared by adding 24 to both sides. So then we have x squared equals 24. And then we think to ourselves, or before we think to ourselves, we're going to take the square root, right? Just to get rid of the x or the squared. Equals, remember when we take the square root, we need that plus or minus square root of 24, right? And then when we have the square root of 24, we must think about the perfect squares, yeah, and simplifying square root of 24. Okay, remember 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, 49, and all of those. So 24 can be 4 times 6. So this is going to be plus or minus square root of 4 times square root of 6. And then we have square root of 4 equals 2. So this breaks out to be 2 square root of 6, right? Plus or minus equals x. And that is my answer there. Okay? All right. Now the next one over, we're going to isolate x squared again. So we're going to subtract 13 on both sides. Okay. And then we're going to have negative 4x squared equals negative 13. And we're going to go ahead and divide by negative 4. So that takes me to x squared equals 13 over 4. And again, we're going to square root both sides. So that x is going to equal square root of 13 over square root of 4 equals 2. That's my answer, correct? Yeah. We're good with this answer? Why no? Yeah, I forgot the plus or minus. Right? So we always need that plus or minus on there, and that was the emphasis of module 9.1, right? Whenever we solve, we take the square root, we need the plus or minus. Okay? But in this section here, 11.1, we have what we call imaginary solutions or imaginary numbers. So imaginary numbers are just square roots, are the square roots of negative numbers. Okay. So the simplest negative number we can take the square root of is square root of negative 1, which I am going to label it imaginary numbers now is just that variable. It's not a variable, but it's just the letter I. Okay? So just a couple of examples here. Okay, like 2i is an imaginary number. Negative 5i is an imaginary number. Negative I over 3 or negative 1/3 I is an imaginary number. I square root of 2 is an imaginary number. And whenever we have a square root with the I, write the I in front of the radical symbol. Okay. And then I square root of 3 over 2 or square root of 3 over 2i. Since I is square root of negative 1, I can say that 2i, the unsimplified version, is square root of negative 4. The unsimplified version of negative 5i is negative square root of negative 25. Do we all see that? On how these two are equal? 2i equals negative square root of 4. Okay. And negative 5i equals negative square root of negative 25. Okay. So coming back up here, if I equals square root of negative 1, we can conclude if I square both sides of I, so I squared and negative square root of negative 1 squared, the square and the square root, they would cancel out, making this equal to negative 1. So the big idea here is that I equals the square root of negative 1, and I squared, if I square an imaginary number, it becomes negative 1. Okay? Right? So if I square any imaginary number, it becomes a real number. Let's try and square 5i. Okay, so if I get 5i, and if I square it, remember the squared here would go to everything that's in here. So negative, the 5 and the I. So this would be 5 squared times I squared, right? Now if 5, what is 5 squared? 25. What is I squared? Negative 1. So 25 times negative 1 equals negative 25. Okay? And just to kind of highlight how we get 5i when we square root negative 25, since I squared 5i, what if I wanted to cancel out what I just did? What do I have to do to negative 25? Square root it, right? And hypothetically, the square root of negative 25 should be what I started with, 5i, correct? Yeah. So let's see if that happens. Negative 25 can be broken down into negative 1 times 25, correct? Yeah. So square root of negative 25 can be square root of negative 1 times square root of 25, right? What's the square root of negative 1? I. What's the square root of 25? 5. So notice that what my answer is and where I started is the same exact thing, right? That's why whenever we see a square root in my answer, a negative number in my square root, in my solution, we are just going to simplify that by taking out the -1 and putting an I on it. Okay, that's the big idea for today. Okay, you guys know how to solve equations, right? 9.1. You guys know how to do 9.1. The only difference is our solutions are going to be imaginary numbers now. Okay, that's the only difference. So let's go over some examples. Actually, let's try this one first. Okay, so if I square -I square root of 2, and if I square it, remember that this square goes to everything here. So it goes to the -1, the I, and the square root of 2. Okay, so -1 squared times I squared times square root of 2 squared, right? So it'll break out to be like that. So -1 squared is just +1, so that just kind of disappears. I squared, square root of 2 squared is just 2, right? Because the squared would cancel out with the square root again. And we just have 2. So this will be 2I squared, but what is I squared? -1 times 2, which equals -2. So, yeah. Okay. Questions on this? Yeah. There's a negative in front of the I because when we solve for a variable, right? When we solve an equation, it's always going to be the plus or the minus. Yeah. So this negative is a part, you guys can think of it as the plus or the minus, and they just took the negative part of it. Yeah. Okay. Try these two out. Actually, just try this one out. Your answer here would be equal to -4. Okay. So your answer there would be -4. And taking the squared of this number, square root of 3 over 3, I squared. This squared, class, goes to the square root of 3, goes to the 3 down here, and it goes to the I. So if I rewrite it with all those squares, it will be square root of 3 squared over 3 squared I squared, right? Just distributing the squared out. Square root of 3 squared is 3 over 3 squared is 9. I squared is -1, right? So this one would be -3 over 9, which is -1/3. Okay. Yeah. All right. Questions on squaring imaginary numbers. Now, we use that skill when we have to rationalize the denominator. Okay, if there's an I in my denominator. Okay. So now let's move on to some equations. Solve the quadratic equation by taking the square root. Allow for imaginary solutions. Okay. So this one's pretty simple. We're going to isolate x squared first by subtracting 12 on both sides. Oops. So we're left with x squared equals negative 12. And then we take the square root on both sides, leaving us with x equals, since we took the square root, we need the plus or the minus. Square root of negative 12. Okay. And now if we think about negative 12, the first thing I want to do is take out that negative, right? So I want to do this step by step. Okay. So x is going to equal plus or minus square root of negative 1 times square root of 12. Square root of 12, class. Now we can simplify that, right? And we'll deal with the square root of negative 1 in a little bit. Okay. Square root of 12, remember, when we are simplifying, again, we are going to think about those perfect squares, right? 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, yeah, and so on and so forth. So 12 can be broken down into 4 times 3, right? So this would be x equals plus or minus square root of negative 1, which is I, square root of 4 times square root of 3, right? So x is going to equal plus or minus I. Square root of 4 is 2. So it's going to be 2I square root of 3. That's my solution. Okay, we allowed for imaginary solutions. Okay? That's the only difference, guys. Please do not overthink this. Okay, it is 9.1 with that little twist. All right? What are your questions? No questions? Yeah. Yeah, the placement of I is going to be like a placement of a variable. Okay? So if you just think about it that way, I think you would know where the I goes. Okay? All right. So let's try this one here. 4x squared plus 11 equals 6. So here I'm going to isolate the x squared first by subtracting 11. So we have 4x squared equals negative 5. And then I am going to divide by 4, right, to isolate the x squared. And then once I isolate that x squared, I'm going to go ahead and take the square root. So x is going to equal plus or minus square root of negative 5 over square root of 4 is 2. So x is going to equal, since negative 5 is just negative 1 times 5, this becomes I square root of 5. Right? Do we all see that, class? Yeah. So since this was negative 1 times 5, right? Square root of negative 1 is your I. Square root of 5 is the square root of 5 divided by 2. Right? Cool? Questions? What are they? So that's just the twist of 11.1 compared to 9.1. Okay. Try number 11. Okay, isolate x squared first. And then your answer should be plus or minus 6i. Before I let you guys go off and do it for a little bit, if your answer is plus or minus 6i, what should your square root be? Square root of, not 36, negative 36. Okay? So in your work somewhere should be square root of negative 36. Okay? So try that out. So here, I am going to subtract 9 first. Try to isolate x squared first. So that would be 1/4 x squared equals negative 9. Now remember, when we want to move the 1/4 times x squared, we have to multiply by its reciprocal. Okay? The reciprocal of 1/4 is just 4. So multiply both sides by 4. And now notice that the 4 cancels out with the 1/4, and we just have x squared here. Okay? Equals negative 9 times 4 is negative 36. And then I am going to square root both sides, right? To get rid of the squared. That means that x equals the square root of negative 36, which we already said that this one is going to be, plus or minus. Plus or minus 6i. We all understand how square root of 36 equals 6i. Yeah. Any questions there? If you do, negative 36 breaks out to be negative 1 times 36. Square root of negative 1 is the I part of it. And then square root of 36 is the 6 part of it. Okay? All right. This one is the last one for today. Okay, so we are going to subtract 3 on both sides, trying to isolate x squared first. So negative 5 x squared equals 10 minus 3 is 7. Then I divide by negative 5. Divide by negative 5. So that x squared equals 7 over negative 7 over 5. Then I am going to square root it. So x is going to equal plus or minus square root of negative 7 over square root of 5. Now here, we have to simplify that because there is no radicals in my denominator, so there's square root of 5. Yeah.
Which would you be negative 7?
I would put the negative. The question was, does it matter if it's where you put the negative in the numerator or the denominator? The value of it, it doesn't matter. But to keep the math simple, yeah, and more efficient, I would put it in my numerator. Okay. So here, I'm just gonna try and rationalize the denominator first before I even deal with the I and the negative 1. Okay. So I'm gonna be multiplying this by what to rationalize the denominator? Square root of 5, right? by the denominator itself. When I do that, when I multiply by square root of 5 on both top going numerator and denominator, therefore x is going to equal plus or minus square root of -7 times 5 is -35 over square root of 5 times square root of 5. I'm going to show you guys that it's the square root of 25 first. Okay. And then deal with the negative. So this becomes I square root of 35 over square root of 25 is 5. So that is my answer. Okay. Questions on this? Yeah. No, get into the habit of putting it in front of the square root, because if you put it in the back, it can look like it's underneath the square root, and that would be wrong. Okay, so just the logistics of where to put that I. Okay, put it or put it before the square root. All right, what are your questions? 11.1. No? Okay. That is the lesson for today, class. Thank you very much.